So it's nice to see a lot of old friends here. My time at the lab goes back to 1975, when I first came with my husband and our 3 sons. He didn't continue at the lab. His work took different kinds of paths. But we continued with Maine. And I lived over in Lemoyne for about, I don't know, 35 or 40 years, something like that, 35 years perhaps, in the summer. My first thought about the talk tonight was, first of all, to help you understand where art historians come from. They're very much like scientists. We identify problems or a challenge. Often it's a question we don't think that has been answered by one of our colleagues sufficiently. And then we look for data, other paintings, writings, we read the literature, we form hypotheses, and then we begin to model and shape that hypothesis. And I really learned a tremendous amount from my husband and the scientists he was working with when he was at the lab. He really taught me, because humanists don't always know what they're doing, they just keep muddling around. And I had not, I had learned well, but I had really not learned a very clear method of approach. And he said, you never get satisfied with an answer, you just use it as a chance to ask another question. And that really has changed my life. It really made me understand what my mission was and what my goal was as an art historian. It's not to find an answer that ends the inquiry. It's to find another question that will continue my pursuit. And a lot of that comes from very careful visual scrutiny, which is what I also think art historians share with scientists. We look very, very carefully at the data. We look for patterns, structures. Sometimes, again, out of that will come a hypothesis of some kind or a paradigm that we're trying to shape. But it always comes really out of the eye. And the earliest artists in the European tradition who worked that way were the artists of the 15th century in Flanders, a little place we know of now as Belgium, or part of Belgium, but which in the 15th century was actually part of the Kingdom of France. And their language was French and so on. That's a historical incident. For reasons one doesn't know, that was really where this extraordinary school of artists interested in nature and the rendering of nature with extraordinary detail really began. We think much of that started with Albrecht Dürer, a name who will be more familiar to you than the one I'll be using shortly, the name of another artist. And here in Dürer's watercolor drawing of a little mountain near Lake Garda in the north of Italy, which he passed when he was traveling in the 1490s, we can see his incredible attention, let's see, to structure, both of quarry-like granite surfaces, as well as the organization of the landscape and the trees. He's exploiting his material. So he's looking very, that is to say, the watercolor that he's using. And those two elements are, I think for me, when I'm looking at works of art, the primary things I'm attending to. The organization, the structure, the way in which the artist has tried to render what he has seen, as well as the materials that he's using in order to enable him to capture that vision. So materials and observation become two of the kind of benchmarks for me of an artist's pursuit, and also the issues that as an art historian I'm going to be attending to. Now, on one of his trips, Dürer went to Flanders, to the town of Ghent. Again, that's close to the Atlantic in Belgium, to see what he said was the most important painting of the time in all of Europe. And it was a painting by Jan van Eyck. I'm ahead of myself, called the Ghent Altarpiece. I'll get to it in a second. Dürer said he wanted to see it because it was a summa of painting. In it, Jan van Eyck had summarized everything there was to know about painting. And he studied it. And what I'm going to back up for you is, I'm trying to back up for you from Dürer to one of, there we are. This was the painting he went to see. The painting made in 1432, signed and dated that year by Jan van Eyck, who died in 1441. So this is about 50 years before Dürer is working. And he has done this watercolor. He's also done the painting, the little watercolor at the left. Looks a little bit like my garden did when I arrived at the beginning of July, full of kind of weeds and overgrown blossom. And it's juxtaposed here with a sketch of a flower by Leonardo da Vinci, done also about in the 1490s. And these two artists on the brink of 1500, we think of them as full Renaissance artists, are fascinated with the natural world. And they get their lessons and observation from the natural world. It's no secret that Leonardo was an engineer and something of a scientist. We don't know that Dürer ever held that brief, but we know that Jan van Eyck held that brief. He was also an engineer, something of a scientist for the man he worked for. And like Leonardo, he worked for a very important duke. Leonardo worked for the Duke of Milan, major military force, cultural force in Italy around 1500. Jan van Eyck worked for the Duke of Burgundy, who was in the 1430s and 40s the most powerful ruler in all of Europe. And I often wonder whether the talents of these two men and their ability to capture natural forces the way they did in their art, does it also have something to do with the patrons that they were working for? Men who used them diplomatically to ensure and reinforce their own rule. So art historians go into history a lot too, and you can tell that interests me. But I really want to stick with the observational skills of Jan van Eyck tonight, which Dürer appreciated, and for that reason he went to look at the Ghent Altarpiece. And at the left, I've replaced Dürer's floral watercolor with a detail of the Ghent Altarpiece. You can see lilies and roses. In studying the Ghent Altarpiece, scholars have counted how many different kinds of botanical specimens are displayed, because the entire lower quarter here is a garden of paradise, essentially, with hundreds of flowers, grasses, trees, bushes. I mean, it has really sent botanical scholars up through the roof in just counting what kind of an array of materials Jan van Eyck painted. Where did he get that knowledge? Herbal manuscripts circulated throughout Europe, and herbals were among the most dependable renderings of nature that actually go back into classical antiquity. So botanical books, herbals, were one of the ways in which an artist like Jan van Eyck would have learned about what a palm tree looked like, or what some other kind of flower that was not native to Flanders. Dave, you were going to ask?
Yeah, Linda, I wonder if you could say more about why Dürer valued this. Was it because of the representational ability of Van Eyck?
Why I valued him?
No, why Dürer apparently admired him.
Oh, that's really, really interesting. And this is going to be like a seminar where you ask questions and I'll just respond. We may never get finished. So why did Dürer value? Well, he said the painting represents the sum of all painting. And he doesn't say a lot more about that. How I've understood that is that he saw in the Ghent Altarpiece every kind of representation that he could imagine. He saw landscape, which was not all that common yet in Europe. He saw atmospheric, the treatment of the atmosphere and clouds. We'll see there's a sunrise emerging behind here. He saw fabrics. He saw the skin, naked skin. I'm going to get to that toward the end. He saw animal life. We actually have little squirrels and other little funny things. There are areas I'm going to show you where birds are just flying, and it looks as though each bird has been studied. And fabricated things like an organ, and we can see an angel behind it working the pedals or whatever. So he saw it rendered or incorporated into this huge 12-foot high by 20 or so meters wide, well, feet wide actually, yeah, a little over 12 feet high. He saw on this series of panels which close and have yet other paintings on the outside, almost everything you could think of rendering, because he called it the sum of all painting, and that's how I understand it. And I've used that in something I've written to argue that it was essentially a handbook for other artists. That Jan painted all the tile and the textile and the clouds and the trees and the birds, everything as a kind of lesson for artists to show them how it could be done. We know there were handbooks written by artists at the time, a few survive. I think, and I've argued that the Ghent Altarpiece is Jan van Eyck's visual handbook for artists who came after him, and I think that text of Doris actually argued, sure.
The fact that he took a lot of this from herbalists is a connection with science, because the herbalists work with medicine people.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, that is one of the connections. Well, there are so many connections. Artists had to grind their own pigments. And where did the pigments come from? Every one of them was natural. So they had to know which blue, which red, which stone, which chemical bonded with which pigment. So they actually were in the pharmacy in little towns, getting their colors from where the doctors would be getting their materials. And something maybe I should have taken that tack in the talk tonight, but herbals also described, or botanical books, describe what flowers would be used for. It may surprise all of you to know that the beautiful lilies, and where did I have it? Well, the iris is related to the lily, which is right there. These were flowers which are written about in the herbals of the 9th, 8th, 9th, 10th, certainly the 14th and 15th century, as helping women with pain, in childbirth, with the afterbirth, with abortion. And some of that information was repressed over time. But substances, floral substances, were the medicines of the time. So you don't even have to just deal with the pigments. Also, these botanical books would have treatises on cosmetics. So there was another relationship between a kind of artifice, which is what art after all is, artifice as well as, let's say, science or healing. The intersections between them are really enormous, and when you go into what the sources for the artists might have been, like these botanical books, you just discover how integrated the artist was into the community. They weren't the outsiders, as we sometimes think those artists living in the woods and not relating to everything else. The 15th century, certainly, and 16th and 17th, the artists were educated, they were learned, and they were practical. So they had that combination of practical as well as observational and educational talents, and could bring them all together.
How old was Durham when you saw the Ghent Altarpiece?
How old was So he has 30 more years to live in the 1490s, so he's a youngish man in 1495 or so, or it's 1512, if you got me now. It could be he's another 15 years. He goes 4 times to the Netherlands, and he talks about it in one of his letters when he comes back. Midlife, let's say.
So he had started.
Oh, he had started, yeah, he had started painting already. So let's look at Jan van Eyck and the Ghent Altarpiece, and I have heard a lot. Jan, we don't know much about where he came from, but we know that he's painting for nobility by the 1420s, and certainly by the late 1420s, 1420, he's working for the Duke of Burgundy, who puts him on a retainer. He doesn't just pay him piecework, he puts him on a retainer. And the Duke of Burgundy has a lot of financial problems, but he keeps Jan on a retainer, and he tells his financial gurus, you better pay him because I'll never find another artist like him. So Jan van Eyck was extremely valued by the Duke of Burgundy. We don't even know what paintings Jan did for the Duke of Burgundy. The Ghent Altarpiece was done for the sort of the mayor of Ghent as a project for the church. But the Duke of Burgundy kept Jan on his payroll because, as I've indicated, Jan served him as a diplomat. We know that Jan was sent across the Alps. We never know exactly where because we're not sure why he was being sent on diplomatic missions. But we know that the Duke sent him on missions for him, possibly to sketch fortifications, possibly to bring back images of things. One very famous trip that Jan van Eyck made in 28 or 29, I'm sorry, I don't remember the exact date now, was to go to Iberia to sketch a princess whom the Duke wanted to marry. And the popular argument or explanation for that is that the Duke wanted to see how beautiful she was. Okay, you'll read that in a whole lot of books. But in fact, I think what really was at stake, and you can read it in my book, is that he wanted to match the woman to the picture when the woman arrived. He didn't want to find out that he had married the wrong girl. And he trusted Jan, whose fidelity to nature had been well proven, to do a precise enough picture so that he could be sure that the woman was the one that Jan had seen, and in fact the one that the Duke was going to marry in absentia before the woman finally got off the boat and arrived in Flanders. It wasn't only her face that Jan van Eyck was drawing, he was also drawing her jewels and her garments. And all of that constituted proof of identity, not just physiognomy, but this kind of paraphernalia that identified how rich you were, what clan you belonged to, and so forth. So that's sort of what the extent, really, of Jan van Eyck's skills. But let's look at some of the details from the Ghent Altarpiece, which has an enormous theological program. I wouldn't even begin to talk about that. It's thought to represent paradise with all the different saints, pilgrim saints, martyr saints, warrior saints, coming in from all corners of the world, and bishops and popes and apostles gathered around a well, which I'll show you again in detail, and then the altar of the Lamb, and painting is also known as the Altarpiece of the Lamb, because the Lamb of God is in the center. And then on the top you have God the Father surrounded by the Virgin and John Baptist. It's a traditional Byzantine grouping, but the painting was also made for the Church of John Baptist, so he's the patron saint in the way of the painting. And then choristers singing as well as playing music, and musicologists have looked, Dave, you may want to study it, at the position of the mouth, and they can tell what note they're singing. So carefully has Jan van Eyck rendered, so carefully has he studied a singer and then been able to render exactly what they're doing. And then most astonishingly, this almost life-size naked Eve and Adam next to these overdressed choristers and saints that accompany us every place else. And on the outside, I said something different. Other scenes, which we can talk about afterward, are on the exterior. But it is the landscape. So you see these incredible, detailed, differentiated trees that are probably no two it the same. You begin to see some of the birds that are just wandering through the sky. And I don't know, I'm always beholden to what I can find on the internet. Colors are not always the same in images, and you'll see in the next slide. But here you can begin to see that this is backlit. The sun is emerging from the lower horizon, and it has backlit the trees. So this much leafier one is golden because of the light that's coming behind it, and that tinges just the tops of the little bushes to the side. So Jan is carefully looking at these effects of sun. I look at them every night when the sun goes down across the Skillings, where my cottage is, And I see, it must be one of the reasons I love Jan van Eyck so much, because it's Maine that I often see when the light is changing and it's playing on the water. I see the nature that Jan van Eyck was looking at so intently as well. This is another detail from further down from the same painting, and perhaps you can see a little more clearly here some of the effect of that backlit sun. So he's looking very carefully at what he sees. That's the observational part, and we'll see it continuously. He also is exploiting a new material that no one had ever exploited like him before. He didn't invent it, which you do read about in books, but he used it in ways that no one else had ever employed it, and that's oil paint. Until Jan van Eyck, oils were used as glazes occasionally on top of tempera. Tempera is an opaque paint, and you can't see through it. You just add layers on top of layers. Oil paint is translucent. Oil is translucent as a glaze, and if you suspend pigment in it, you'll be able to see through layers of application. And Jan was the one who really spent his career exploring what oil paint could do for him. He would never have been able to accomplish this without oil paint, and the same is true for a couple of the other details or pictures that I'm going to show you. So the material that he was using and exploiting for its translucency and its transparency, the possibility to be able to see through it sort of mistily, but also see through it clearly. I sound like St. Paul perhaps, but it's a theological issue as well. And even though my interest in the work I do has been on the secular and craft side of painting, theology has, that is the belief system within which this work was made, has always been an important element for me. And working with oil paint and this dimension to see it mistily but see it clearly, I think is an important contributor to the spiritual resonance and meaning of Jan van Eyck's work. Here's this detail of the birds. These are smaller than you can imagine, but you can see that each one, it's almost a lesson in the way in which the birds are cavorting at sunrise. So observation, I show you a detail that shows you other people were thinking about nature, about birds and animals about the same time. Ghent Altarpiece is 1432. This is a series of playing cards that are in Stuttgart now. We're not exactly sure where they were made, probably in the kind of Rhine area, and we think that that area that separates Belgium from Germany, but really was a common zone of commerce and production in the late Middle Ages, early modern period. We don't know what game was played with these. These cards were at the Cloisters Museum this winter, and they were really extraordinary to see. About so big, and the different suites have different numbers of birds, but you can see what attention is being given by someone else, an anonymous artist, around the same time as Jan van Eyck, to studying a bird and really defining it from all different kinds of angles. Jan was asked by the Duke to paint nobility who came to visit, and he paints Cardinal Albergati in the early 1430s, probably during a visit to Belgium as part of a church council. He paints him and he draws him. He does the drawing first, and he puts some writing in Vienna. He puts some writing on the drawing that says what color his eyes are, what his hair looks like, what tint to give to the skin. He's giving himself directions in the drawing that will then be carried out when he does the painting. Now the drawing is smaller than the painting. And scholars have thought, well, how did he do the painting? Well, and we can actually see a mashup of the drawing and the painting here. the two wouldn't quite overlap exactly. What you'd have to do is sort of move the drawing from one side to the other to fill the face out as you enlarged it slightly. And someone has come up with the idea that Jan made use of a mirror or some kind of technical device in order to convert his drawing into a painting. So he would put the drawing on one surface, the mirror would pick up the picture and then reflect it on another surface, and by moving the drawing, he'd be able to make corrections to the contour of the face or the head according to what he felt he needed. David Hockney, an artist whom I'm sure many of you have heard of, is a contemporary artist who has actually explored very elaborately the use of technical aids, we might call them, by artists from Jan van Eyck down through the centuries. And Jan van Eyck is a particular interest of his because we want to think that this man did it all with his own hands and eyes. And yet Jan himself tells us that he was knowledgeable about lenses, about possibilities for distortion that were provided for him by technical aids. So Jan invited us and invited David Hockney to even speculate on what kind of technical aids Jan van Eyck might have had, using another kind of scientific implement, we might say, to aid him with his observations. This kind of camera oscura, or a camera lucida it's called, it's a kind of thing you could buy for your kids 20, 30, 40 years ago. And it consists really of two mirrors, one that will pick up a reflection and the other will project it, accompanied by little lens that will project it onto paper. So I'm looking at you and you're being projected onto my paper, and then I'm drawing fundamentally over the projection, like the slide of that's being projected off of the scene that I'm looking at. And yes, maybe artists did that. We know later artists certainly were working that way from photographs. You saw Tim's Vermeer. Anybody see that movie? It argues something very similar for Vermeer, a 17th century contemporary of Rembrandt, working again with a reflection, a mirror and a lens that reflect a scene onto paper from which he then copies. It's not copying from life, it's life reflected that he's copying. Here's another example, this one from HM7, that gives you perhaps a better idea of how this projection and tracing in a way would work. Another portrait that Jan van Eyck inserts into a painting he made for this man, Canon Nicholas van der Pijl, who was a canon of a church in Bruges, the Church of Saint Donation, which still exists. And we're told from an inscription on this, a detail of this big picture, that there were days when Canon van der Pijl was too ill to perform Mass. And this painting, we believe, stood in for him. Tells us what, like that portrait of the princess in Spain, it tells us that paintings had were such phenomena that they participated in reality in ways that we can't even begin to imagine, but they really had status as testimony and as evidence for in high places, let's say, in important ways. Jan has, others have looked at this now, scholars, have noticed that you could probably diagnose some kind of condition on this, what he was suffering from when he couldn't come to say Mass, because of the wrinkles and swellings in the veins that you see by his brow. Others have looked and thought he might have cataracts on his eyes. I mean, I love to read what ophthalmologists and their internists have just, they look at one little piece of painting, but they're doing what the artist was doing, which is looking very carefully and closely at the details of the artist, just as the artist had looked very closely at the detail of his sitter.
What you might also notice is that behind Canon van der Pijl are these round, blown glass panels in the window of the church in the Isle of which Canon van der Pijl is being posed. You see it also over here. And that's a little clue that Jan van Eyck is also interested in the not just architectural details, but in the phenomenon of blown glass, which distorts. It's translucent, you'll get light through it, but you're not going to see through it. And indeed, that is a hint to us at some of the other interests that Jan van Eyck has. This translucency with glass is something he plays with in the background, but nonetheless he plays with in his picture. And when we look at the detail of the canon, he's holding his prayer book, but he's taken off his glasses. And indeed, some of the print that we see through this lens is a little larger than what we see next to it. And we know that magnifying glasses were available in 1433 or so, or 5, I think, for people to use. And Jan makes it very clear that this magnification, a kind of a lens, is available in his community. Again, another clue to the fact that Jan is not ignorant of these technological developments which can facilitate the kind of work he wants to do. And the most famous example of his technological aid is the mirror, which I'm sure many of you know, in the back of a painting I'll show you in a moment. Hangs on the back wall of a room. Here's the painting itself. It's in the National Gallery in London, signed and dated by Jan 1434. And the mirror is really an incredible work. So mirrors had not been that common in Europe. They started coming in from Venice in the late 14th century, but those are mostly plate glass. This is clearly a bullseye glass because we can see distortions at the outer rims on both sides. So that's all here, and what he shows you on the mirror is a reflection of what you otherwise cannot see, because you are standing out here, and whatever is happening in the mirror is really happening behind you. So you're positioned in front of a mirror invisibly, and the reflection he shows you is what's happening behind you. Some have argued that you are one of these people, I mean, to get everything to fit together. I'm not sure that that was Jan's intention. Anyway, that's what we argue in our books that we write. What you see here is a reflection. So he takes this glass, which has had silver paint or something painted on the back of it, and he gives you a reflection off the surface, a reflection that shows you more than you can see. And I enjoy that as something of a metaphor for painting, which, and maybe for science too, showing you more than you think you can see, or more than you know you see. And the challenge then is to keep looking. Maybe you'll never see it all, but the challenge to try is what really forges you ahead, whether you're an art historian or whether you're working in one of the buildings around us here. Around the mirror, he has little other round forms, which you may be able to make out. The crucifixion, these are scenes from the life of Christ, and it is scenes of the Passion as they go all the way around. Well, they're not just any little scenes. Jan van Eyck took glass, little domical pieces of glass, painted on the back, and then this is what you have to imagine he's rendering, because we know this kind of production of little glass roundels. They are painted on the back in gold and then reversed and inserted into a frame. So what he's done here is simulated looking through glass to a painting on the back. Here you've got the reflection off the surface. Here you're looking through the surface to get something. And you see how charged this his fascination is with working with translucent or transparent material. And then if you look at the prayer beads, which are at the side, you get both effects. You get, these are amber beads. They have a kind of yellowish color. They probably come from the North Baltic. Bruges, where this painting was made, we know that Jan van Eyck lived in Bruges, was the major port for trade into Europe from the Baltic Sea in the early years of the 15th century, and it was actually where the first stock market was. In the Bourse was in Brussels, so it had in Bruges. Bruges had a very, very important role to play in terms of commerce coming into Europe, and the picture is about commerce with all its wonderful fabrics and so on. So amber beads, but look how they're painted, giving reflection on one side and giving the sense of a kind of translucency on the other side. I mean, it boggles the mind the extent to which Jan van Eyck is trying to deal with not just the fascination with the materials in his environment and his ability to render them, but with exploiting how far oil glazes can go in helping him do that. This is the whole painting, fascinating to me not only for the reasons I just said, but because it also tells an enigmatic story, supposedly about a marriage. And I won't go any further than that. But it is known to be exceptionally unusual in 1434 because these are ordinary people. We think we know who they are, although that's controverted by various things for some individuals. But they're not queens and princes and notables of the realm. In fact, what we think is that he was a merchant who sold clothing and hats to the Duke. But we think she was the daughter of his banker. That's a little more important. But that's a whole other story. Yes?
I don't know a lot about painting.
Don't apologize.
But the altarpiece looks like it's much more modern in the sense of perspective and the sense of the figures. This looks more like the flatter ones of the earlier period to me, these figures. They're not as lifelike, I think. I mean, to
You
me,
know, the altarpiece was probably made over a period of time. His studio may have helped him with some of that. He's also creating a different kind of universe. And those are all factors we have to think about. And Jan had incredible skill to do what he wanted when he wanted. And I think we have to think of, what's the big picture here, let's say. And the altarpiece would have been in a chapel, only light coming in from side windows. There would have been a whole variety of circumstances of its display that would also have affected exactly how you saw it and how you wanted it to be seen. So those are other things to bear in mind for some of the discrepancies you're rightly seeing. I think they depend upon where these things were intended to be. Here you see the Ghent altarpiece in Ghent in this plexiglass box because it's been under restoration for many, many years now. And every time they take a panel or two out to work on, they work on it where you're able to see it. Restoration is complete now, but you can go on the web, put in Ghent altarpiece, and you'll find the website of the restoration, and you'll be able to read all kinds of things all about it. At the time this photo was taken, the Adam and the Eve were being restored, so that's why they had just black and white photographs in the place. But this gives you an idea of how grand and large the project is. And I want to get to the well, and what's in the next slide is a detail of the well, so that you can just see what Jan is doing. He's taken all his fascination that he had with mirrors, glasses, blown glass, flat glass, plate glass, mirrored glass, and he's converted it to water, so you get reflections of the pipe through which the jets of water are coming out. You get a sense of both the surface, almost the little wavelets, and then the depths of the water. You get the droplets and how they actually make little holes in the water. He has observed the water in an extraordinary way as the little jets and springs are playing off of it. And try to render these multiple qualities that this water has. It's not just an opaque surface. It has opacity, it has translucency, it reflects. It does all of this because light shines on it in different ways. And we know that very well here. According to the angle of the light, the water will look differently. It will be showing us different things. We can see through it, or we can only see the sky. And this is what Jan is observing, but most of all, it's what he's capturing as he exploits this new tool he has, which is called oil paint.
On that last one, how big is that detail?
The well,
How big is that detail in real life?
well, it's over here. It's the lower part of this
So
well.
it's like.
So it, no. It's like that.
Oh, okay.
It's a good,
Oh,
it's the lower chunk of this that I've showed
I
you.
see.
Okay. So the last point in it is, what about that Adam and Eve that were pulled off here for restoration? Well, maybe some of you are also a little curious or offended by their nudity. They barely have fig leaves, they do, but barely. And isn't this surprising in 1432 actually, that such nakedness in a way is embraced within a scene of paradise? Well, the 19th century wasn't too happy with them, or the late 18th.
No.
And somebody in Ghent ordered that substitutions be made for the Adam and Eve, and you see them here in their animal skins. And these still exist in the church. If you go to Ghent, the real Adam and Eve are back where they belong, but these wings still stand there with their animal skins covering their bodies as though the skin was something to be ashamed of. Jan van Eyck thought the skin was fascinating. He did not find anything shameful. And in it, I think he made an enormous theological statement about Adam and Eve. Not that they were sinners, but that they were progenitors of mankind. Adam is a laborer who works with his hands, and Eve is the first mother from whom all progeny will descend. So if we look at them as they really are, get the animal skins out of the way, but I think it's interesting to see them. And I just have...
displayed that, when they displayed, have they been restored, or are they still in their skin?
They are back in their place now, and the ones with the animal skins are at a separate location in the church. So we have Adam, and you can see they both have their fig leaves. But don't you notice he has hands that are sunburnt? Okay? Can you see that? And different pictures make them look redder or not. And scholars for a long time, and it took a while for anybody to want to talk about nudity like this because it's a little awkward, it's not appropriate perhaps, or you start dealing with subjects people are uncomfortable and looking at or even talking about. But some scholars have said, well, what he did was study a live model. He brought someone into the studio who had been outside, had him undress, and he had suntanned hand because this person had been working out of doors. As though Jan needed to have that happen for him to get the idea that he wanted the sunburned hands. In fact, the sunburned hands talk about Adam's labor. They call attention to the hands. They talk about Adam becoming a laborer after the fall. And this is really the moment of the fall. He's hiding his body, which means he's self-aware, but we don't see him cowering and we don't see him animal skins. So Jan van Eyck has taken, if you think of the story of creation, temptation, and expulsion, he's taken an incredible moment of self-awareness after temptation, but before God has said, out with you and go to work. He's used the hands to suggest a future event, namely that Adam will work and his hands will become discolored by the sun. But he doesn't show us the furious angel, he doesn't show us him, he doesn't show them wearing animal skins, he doesn't show that part of the story. So you may not believe me about that. But let's look to Eve's body and see what we see there. And again, people have said, well, she has that shape of a 15th century woman, high-breasted, tiny waist, full hips. That's kind of the fashion of what they actually wore. Here's another view of Adam. If we look closely at her belly, we do notice something that, again, few people really want to talk about. We see that there's a dark line going down from her navel, which midwives know, and gynecologists and dark complexioned women might know, represents that pulling apart of muscle plates around the 4th month of pregnancy, which is called the linea nigra, the black line that shows on many women's, not all, but many women's stomachs at a certain moment in the beginning, let's say, of the 2nd trimester. And indisputably, Jan has represented that on Eve's body. So he's telling us, as he does with Adam, that she will be a mother. She will, this is what her fate is going to be, just as Adam's is to labor, hers is to bear children. Neither one of them, however, in this painting does it with shame. Both of them do it self-aware, unashamedly, very forthrightly. And what Jan has really accomplished, sticking to the idea not only of observation, you could say, how did he know? He had a wife, he had some kids. Maybe, that's where his information came from. Maybe he talked to the doctors he met at the pharmacy. We can't doubt how he came to that knowledge because the painting tells us he had it. He shows us that he had that knowledge. And when I was rereading an article I wrote about this earlier today, I came to the end of it and I say something like, his observation, let me say this, we don't read about this in gynecological handbooks as far as I've been able to tell until sometime in the 18th century. No one makes a point about what is now known very widely. And so I say something like, Jan's observational skill trumps the silence in the gynecological manuals of the time. Not sure I would phrase it that way anymore. I changed the verb, right? But in any case, that's what we have. And the last point let me make here is that what Jan is doing, once again, he's using his glazes to show light's effects. And here what you have is light irradiating skin. I don't know if that's the correct word or not, but it has darkened the skin. Glazes darken also. So he's very conscious of the properties that oil glazes have as they can darken over time in the sun. In fact, one of the handbooks of the time, named an Italian wrote, says if you want certain effects from your oil, let it sit out in the sun and the oil will darken for you. So the darkened glaze is really the effect of the sun, which is exactly what has transformed the color of Adam's skin. And in this case, what you're seeing is a not quite a translucency, but you're seeing internal effects that he's rendering through light. So in both cases, he gives transformative theological interpretations of the first couple. He's using his observational skills, but he's also relying on this the capacity of the material that he's working on to bring forth or embody, we might say, what his goal actually is. Somebody was going to ask me something. Yeah.
The images above and the neck.
Yeah. Above each one of them is a representation, Adam and Eve. And this is Cain about to kill Abel. And this is, well, let me think about this. And this is the actual murder of Cain, murdering Abel. This is Abel at prayer and Cain just holding his wheat sheaves. And then this is the actual murder here. Why they're on both sides, I mean, there's a long interpretation given for that. But those are the two sons. And so once again, we see that something prospective, something future is being indicated. because they don't have their children yet. But the capacity to bring the story into the future, so to speak, is what Jan has actually shown us with his rendering of the belly and the hands. The Ghent Altarpiece is one of the most celebrated paintings in Europe. It was when Dürer went to see it, and we know that it was one that Hitler wanted to have in the museum he planned for himself in Austria. And this is a photograph. Some of you may know the movie The Monuments Men, which was out a couple of years ago. This was in the movie. It's a photo of the Monuments Men finding it in a salt mine in Austria. The well is covered up actually over here, but you'll recognize some of the background. It has an extraordinary history as to how fascinated so many people over time, over the, more than 560, 70 years since it was painted, have found it. And so the last image is just to remind you, this is Adam's eye, but it is to just help you see this amazing close-up that Jan has painted with that, even that tiny reflection, that glint of light off of his eye, to make you take away after this evening the notion of observation and how critical that is as a skill for all of us in whatever kind of work we do. And then I was thinking about these wonderful beads and how they, small little things that they are, we can look through them. Just the way in which we can actually look through them made me think of zebrafish. So there you have how we get from art to science.